the left is willing to go after someone out protesting outside a leftist home, right? Up in Boston, the mayor. While you have federal law that specifically prohibits, through criminal sanction, protests outside the home of a Supreme Court justice. And this Justice Department refuses to enforce that law. We had a little interesting lawsuit in Massachusetts, in Boston, Massachusetts, that uncovered documents showing that they were the Boston police, seemingly at the urging of political officials in Boston, were concocting ways to arrest people criminally for protests outside the mayor's home that could only be punished civilly. So Mayor Wu, who is the new mayor in Boston, I don't know how new she is. Maybe she was elected last year, 1 year or 2 years. So she's a big leftist, and she had come up with this draconian COVID-oriented restrictions, which required people to show proof of COVID-19 vaccinations to enter certain indoor spaces, including indoor dining, fitness, and entertainment venues. And so protests began outside her home shortly thereafter. The Boston City Council then passed an ordinance. This began in January 2022. So it shows you how outrageous those regulations were. I mean, you know, the idea that you would have COVID shutdowns and restrictions in January 2022 is just absurd. So there were protesters outside her home. So the Boston City Council then passed an ordinance that prohibited and enforced with civil fines protests outside residences during certain hours. I think it was 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. On April 25th, 2022, a woman, Shannon Llewellyn, was arrested outside the mayor's home and criminally charged for violating the ordinance that only allowed for civil enforcement. Sure enough, on September 6th, just last week, or I guess this week, a Boston judge later ruled that Llewellyn was wrongfully arrested. So we saw this was going on, and we asked for documents. We got the runaround from Boston, and we wanted records concerning the enforcement of that ordinance. Now, personally, and I'm sure you probably share my personal views, I don't have objections to restricting protests in residential areas to be either enforced with civil fines or potentially criminal sanctions. But here the law only allowed for enforcement with civil sanctions. But that wasn't good enough. And the documents show that the police were thinking of ways. The City Council adopted the law on March 30th, and what they tried to do was come up with this way of getting people arrested criminally for it. Because I guess they were politically embarrassed by having to arrest people, at least on the surface, so they thought of a backdoor way to do it. And the way they thought about, and the way they constructed, as these documents show, was that they say, well, you know, the first time you get a civil enforcement, you know, a civil fine potentially. The second time you're going to be charged with a willful violation of a civil statute. Now, does that sound like, you know, catch-22 to you? It does to me. And it obviously did to a court who found that someone arrested under that rubric was wrongfully arrested. So, I mean, this shows you the hypocrisy of the left in Boston. They don't respect the First Amendment, and they don't respect the rule of law. Because by limiting it to civil fines, they're telling people, you know, potentially, I guess you can protest, but there's going to be a civil penalty if you break the rules. Instead, they made it much riskier to protest in that regard by imposing arrests and criminal sanction in a way the law didn't allow them to do. And we confirmed that in these documents. So it's really quite remarkable what we were able to uncover here. And it's clear that the courts didn't want, or the police didn't want, civil enforcement. They wanted criminal enforcement of this. And you know, when you're talking about the police, I'm talking about the chief and captains, people at the senior levels who are involved in this. The first set of emails comes from a then police captain. A lieutenant is quoted here. The police captain sends is obviously managing this. The internal affairs division's involved in this. So this had all the bureaucracy involved. So they're remarkable documents in that regard. And you know what I think is interesting about this is how quickly they are. The left is willing to go after someone out protesting outside a leftist home, right? Up in Boston, the mayor. While you have federal law that specifically prohibits, through criminal sanction, protests outside the home of a Supreme Court justice. And this Justice Department refuses to enforce that law. They'll raid someone's home, President Trump's home, over empty folders, as I like to say, because they found empty folders, right? That was outrageous. They were empty folders. There could have been classified information in those empty folders. But they won't protect the Supreme Court justices who are being intimidated by radical leftists. But in Boston, you complain about masks and COVID, you'll be fined, and they'll think of ways to criminally arrest you even if they don't have the law on their side there. That's today's left. It shows you the double standards. It shows you the fact that the rule of law is misused to apply to only one political outlook. And we can't stand for that. And we have to expose that corruption and end it. And we're not going to end it unless we expose it. And that's what Judicial Watch is doing, obviously with your support. So that was a nice little victory in terms of getting that information out. And we hope the courts go to town now by protecting people from this lawlessness up in Boston, to protect Mayor Wu from getting too much in the way of protests over her draconian COVID policies. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.